And this laser technology is what is a collaboration between Cymer and what finally enters ASML. And that is why the control of the technology lies still with the US. So if I go into this in more details, which I will not, it's there in my paper. I have a physical paper, so all of you have to read it if you want to know more about it. So I'm not repeating what I've said in the paper. So knowledge is a key component of technology, and technology is a key component of science because it developed the instruments of science, while the knowledge that scientific institutions produce is what today goes into production of the tools. Now, I'm going to talk about, fortunately, Ashok has already covered this ground, that what was the vision of self-reliance that we had, which was both developing scientific knowledge and developing technology. He has parsed technology into two parts, really, which I'll come to just a little later, which is that it's not enough to build a steel plant. You also have to have the knowledge and the industry which builds the steel plant. But the freedom movement had that vision. It says we need to invest in human beings. Therefore, expansion of science institutions, technology institutions. So therefore, a huge investment in education in the first 5-year plan. We have to have the CSIR, which builds the scientific infrastructure of the country, and we have to build the public sector. So both knowledge and the industry, even within the industry, how to build plants along with the plants, both were put together. Zoom कर लेना, ये पहले करके रखना चाहिए, sorry. Now it looks better. So this was a technological failure on my part that I was supposed to zoom this. As you know, old people don't understand computers well. So this is my problem. Okay. Pardon? Coming from me, that too. Okay. I'm 75, I've forgotten all of this. Okay. So coming back to this, that if you take this, what Ashok talked about, you will see that those were the elements that were there. We built Damodar Valley Corporation for hydroelectric projects. But we also had, later, we also did, at the time, Heavy Electrical Corporation, I think, HEC, I don't know what I forget all the abbreviations. Heavy Engineering Corporation. We also had, I think, Heavy Electricals, which all merged into BHEL. From hell to bloody hell. So all of this, the vision was, it's not enough to build dams, it's not enough to build the turbines, at that time hydro turbines, not enough to build boilers also, it's not enough to build power plants, steam generation power plants, but to get the technology for it is how do you build a boiler, how do you build a turbine. We needed to do that as well. All of that later becomes one organization, which is from a boiler company which was set up in Trichy. It becomes a part of BHEL. So all this vision was there, just as he talked about also about the steel plant. When we talked about at that time atomic energy was supposed to be the future. I think the atomic energy chair in the United States said that energy will be so cheap, it will not need to be metered. It will be free. That was the vision. So we had set up BARC as well. But the important part is the huge expansion or investment we made in human beings. I'm taking a little more time than what is allotted on the schedule because Satyajit has been very kind to say he's not going to speak too long. He's also commented that too many presidents on the podium. No, it's all right. I'm poaching on his time, don't worry. Dinesh is trying to speed me up. This is a complete inversion of what normally happens. So, I will talk about 4 phases of technology development here. All of this is in great detail in my paper, so I'm not going to go into details over here. But when do you, if you are talking about self-reliance, do you start from scratch? Do you buy technology when it is mature? Or do you do something different by looking at early growth, late growth? When do you intervene yourself in the technology cycle of development? Because continuously new technologies will emerge. If new technologies emerge, then where would you actually intervene? And if there is already stable technology, what do you do? These are the questions that we need to think about when you look at different kinds of technologies which exist. Now, simply put, if you talk about pharmaceuticals, the plants are small, the capital cost is small. So you may decide, I'll do everything from scratch. So I'll start very early. But if you are talking of, say, building a refinery today, petroleum refinery, would you even build one? Or will say, well, I'll just import, because building a petroleum refinery at the late stage when maybe oil will no longer be the fuel in another 10 years, you are going to get renewable energy, maybe it's not worth investing in this. So there is a question of how much you invest, when you invest, and when it comes to technology, where in the technology cycle you will invest, while you may take another industry and say, well, you know, steel is always going to be there. So I'll invest in the steel plant, buy the technology, because it doesn't make sense today to develop steel technology independently. If you take basic steel production, but I will say maybe invest in certain other areas of steel, maybe the special steels and so on. So these are decisions you need to take looking at the technology cycle, and also the size of the plants involved, the capital cost involved. So then you come to what is the lifespan of a plant. And it varies from plant to plant. Again, the interesting part is, generally, and let me sort of skip over this slide very quickly to this slide, that if you take, for instance, a plant today, then R&D expenditures are high generally for those plants where the capital cost is low, with one exception. That exception is chips. Chips today, to set up a chip manufacturing plant, a chip foundry, takes about 12 to 18 billion dollars. Okay, while the life of the latest chips are 3 to 5 years. 3 to 5 years, a new generation comes in. It's not that that plant's become outmoded. It still produces chips and can continue to produce chips much longer, but it is no longer on the cutting edge. This is a technology instability, if you will, which no other technology has except pharmaceuticals, where the cost of R&D is high, but that way, cost of the plant is low. It takes a lot of money to do the basic chemical, whatever it is, or the biologics today, but the cost of the plant is low. Unlike chips, where the cost of R&D is high, the cost of plant is also high in semiconductors. This is the only one. All others you will see long life cycle of the plant, 25, 30, 50 years, refineries, steel plants, etc., etc. And the cost of the plant is also high. So this is the difference that is there in technologies. All technologies are not identical. They are basically, nature of the technology is different. And I would also focus on one element today, that a plant or a company today, what Ashok was talking about, what is its basically knowledge, capital. And you will see today a capital value of a company, what is called market capitalization in today's capitalist terms. The market gives the value per share, and that gives you the market cap of the company. You will see today, unlike, say, what it was 40 years back, that today the capital cost of the company is what is called intangibles, not physical assets, intangibles. Intangibles means of course, a lot of hot air. I'm not getting into that, but it also means knowledge, software. These are the two important elements of such companies, which is why ASML is one of the largest companies in the world till the Chinese sanctions. Then their market has fallen because they can't sell to the biggest market, which is China. But if we take the cost, today you will see the companies, IT companies. No, Apple is the biggest company in the world in terms of market cap, has no factory. But it holds not only patents but also knowledge, the designs, the software, all that is held by. So it's not a company which just has a brand name, which of course is also important. So intangibles today have become much more important than it was earlier. This is knowledge I've said as red, essentially, that it is you pay for Apple's brand value, you also pay for software, which however many times it's repeated doesn't get worn out. It can be replicated almost without any cost. So if you take the cost of manufacture, it's only about $7. This is what Foxconn gets. If you take the cost of all the intangibles, then you will see the cost of iPhone is about $500, $400, $500. So this is the equation between manufacture and what is the quote-unquote the value of the phone. Now, does it mean that when we talk about self-reliance, that we have missed the boat? So that's why I talked about that technology is always opening new opportunities. So question is, how do you intervene on them? There's a history over here, which I'm not going to go into details, that power sector, which Ashok has already gone over here, which is repeated in fertilizer steel. These are big plants. Technology has not changed significantly except for solar. So we had a window of opportunity, which is when solar came in. Everybody was in power. China got in at not get in at this stage because we depended on Adanis, who will set up power plants but not how to build power plants. They took plants from China. China was the biggest supplier of plants to Adanis. Indian IPPs, when they came up, who were only building power plants, they were mostly buying Chinese equipment, South Korean equipment. BHL was the one they went to last because they didn't get various incentives which they got from other companies, which is, we'll pay you, you pay us abroad, we'll give you money back abroad, etc., etc. We won't go into. Adani's court case is there, which Ashok talked about. Unfortunately, I'm under an embargo. I have criminal defamation on me for having talked about the Supreme Court judgment on that count, criticizing it. I'm in NewsClick, I'm the editor, so therefore I'm under injunction, both criminal and civil. So I'm not, so those are the things, but it's public domain, so you can read it all up. But this is also what has been followed also in the fertilizer sector. One major change was, of course, the World Bank coming in and saying all these technologies have to change. So I'm not getting into the details of that, but we had windows of opportunity. BHL could have become, like Doosan did, like, for instance, various Chinese companies did. We could have become world suppliers because the Americans and the Europeans could not any longer compete on that market. So BHL was a global, in fact, it was better. They could produce better equipment than Chinese could. That's what the experience in the Indian power sector is. But they were in fact sabotaged effectively with the 91 policy which Ashok has talked about. Telecom, C-dot switch at that time, which started with the PABX, was also what Huawei started with the PABX. And while that was really not as advanced as C-dot could scale up much faster from 64, 128 to 10,000 lines, and it was stopped from going beyond 10,000 lines because of Indian telecom policies that was going to be with Alcatel. So we could not go beyond that. But the technology was in advance of what Huawei did at that point of time, except, of course, we destroyed C-dot later. So if you go into this history, you will find we had opportunities, whether it was fertilizers or whether it was power sector, whether it was, for instance, in telecom. We have opportunities and we will get these opportunities again, provided we have all the infrastructure which we had, which we seemed to have earlier, which was aborted by first the Manmohan Singh and company, and later, of course, Modi taking a hammer to it, which he has at the moment. Pharmaceutical is the only one which we have succeeded for some at least for some time now. But again, we are giving up to the Chinese actually what would be called today, we used to call it bulk drugs. Now there is some other set of words for it. APIs. Okay. So basically the basic drug production is passing into the hands of the Chinese. We are putting it together, pills, bottling it and giving it. So that seems to be the way it seems to be going. Now, I'm not going to details of this, I've already covered this. I will only talk about the last, hopefully it's my last slide. Yes, I think we can leave out the rest. That when you want to develop self-reliance, therefore, it is not enough to develop just the plants. It is not just enough to develop what are the final production where it takes place, the steel, even the pharmaceuticals, even the telephone switches are produced. You really have to invest in the people. Why? Because technology changes very quickly. And if technology changes very quickly, knowledge is increasingly the share of what goes into either a hadron collider or into a cell phone. Both require advances which are taking place, and that is knowledge. You have to invest, therefore, in people. And if you want to invest in people, you have to invest in research and the scientific institutions. Interestingly, the United States, all the private research laboratories, including the famous Bell Labs, has closed down. It is in the universities that research takes place. It's funded by military, largely. Patents are held by the university and sold to private companies. That was the Bayh-Dole Act, which says publicly funded research can end up with the property of the private companies. And that meant that what was becoming much more difficult, that building a science research institutional capacity which could supply the needs of capital was no longer feasible within the roof of one company. Therefore, the state took the responsibility. We will develop all this for you, and legally will make it possible that you own the property of the universities by paying them some money. So this whole institutional structure of research and science, without which capital cannot develop, has been engineered in this way. And where does the knowledge come from? Well, actually, Indians and Chinese used to go to the United States. 50% of the STEM graduates, I think more than that, of STEM graduates, as it is called in the United States, are Indians and Chinese. Now, the Chinese have dropped off because of all the things that are happening between the US and China. That means the drain of Indians going there will be much more. In fact, in chips, most of the electronic design tools, as they are called, come from India and are developed by Indians, but foundry is not here. The foundries are now going to come, but the knowledge to make the foundries is not going to come. This is the key issue today, that if 80% of the capital of a company is knowledge or intangibles, where do we do it? Who are the people who build it? What is the institutional structure of science that we have? These are the key questions to be faced. And if you take Mr. Modi and his government, in his self-reliance, there is no place for people. It's only capital and capitalists. So that is the reason why increasingly we are going on back to a neo-colonial path. I think I'm going to end here and leave it now to others. Okay? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Prabir. He has covered, well,
I did exactly what I was cautioning Ashok about.
The relationship between science, technology, and industry. I will just give you a simple example of how policy matters. You know, we all know that coal is now on the downward trend because of climate change and so on and so forth. So coal manufacturing is obviously going to be affected. Look at what China did and what India did. Chinese anticipated that coal production will come down, so coal manufacturing is going to come down. So whatever we have to, in the process of shutting down the coal manufacturing, whatever capacity is there available, we should export it. So they went head-on exporting. So even in a country, even in a country like India, they pushed 34 thermal power plants, whereas in India we destroyed whatever we have. That's the difference. And now I request Mr. Ram to speak.
So you have a presentation? No, I don't have a presentation, but I'll stand.
Yeah.
Yeah, is it working? Yeah. Good morning, and thank you particularly to Prabir for having said most of what I need to say on the matter of self-reliance, Atmanirbharta, I mean the works. My concern, or rather what I would really like to concentrate about, is the foundation of what has been pointed out. To have a self-reliant country, to this entire process of Atmanirbharta requires highly trained people. And the person, I mean, the trained individual is at the heart of it, more than technology which can be imported, places where you can assemble a lot of stuff, all that is there. But at the heart of it is the individual. What has been happening in the education sector in our country has, to a very large extent, worked against this. The national education policy, or the new education policy of 2020 that has been implemented, is making very, very significant changes in the educational landscape of our country. It's not that our educational system was very good earlier. We've been suffering, struggling and moving along with it. It has largely been continuance of a lot of policies, but many institutions were started with certain sort of big goals in mind. The IITs, the CSIR system, all these various national laboratories that were set up. Prabir has already gone into that, as has Ashok. And there was a plan. The plan was to make a large number of highly competent people who could, in some sense, by being made competent in India, they could also contribute to solving some of the problems of, that are very particular, geographical, social, and so on. Our aim was only partially realized because, as we all know, the IIT system that flourished in the 60s largely exported its people to the West, mostly to the US, and much of Silicon Valley was in fact built with the expertise that engineers, technologists got from our public education system and contributed to the innovations and the sort of the overall contributions to technology were done elsewhere. We, as has been pointed out, were in a sense happy to bring back the technology and the know-how, but we didn't have the, we didn't build the foundations over here. This process of seeing the US or seeing the West as the market for our educated products has, it has been continuous. In fact, many institutions that were started, the new ones that were started, the IITs went from 5 at some point to 23 now. There are these ICERs, the NICERs, and so on. A very large fraction of the trained youth that comes out of these institutions goes abroad. And at one point in time, this used to also be the advertised on the websites of these institutions that half our graduates or more are going abroad, so you too send your children over here and they too will go abroad or something. Okay. Now, the NEP 2020, which is now mandated to be adopted by every publicly funded institution and many privately funded ones, has the seed within it to undermine undermine the basis of STEM education that we took 70 years to develop, or 60 years, or whatever. The model that was followed of developing a really competent STEM education, whether they all went abroad or not is not even the point, but the actual quality of the education was very good. That's why they were taken up abroad, and it was just pointed out, a lot of the innovations that happened were done by Indians and Chinese students in the US because the basic education was that good. And what is happening now is this NEP 2020. I've studied it in great detail because I happen to be at an IIT over here and have been at universities in our country in the public education system. There are structural things that are really incorrect about it. It's an inconsistent document, but let that be. School education is very severely impacted because instead of strengthening the public education system at the school level, a lot of lip service is paid to concepts that are actually irrelevant and impractical in our country, and actually will not produce well-trained school students ready to go to university. But let me just concentrate on the university system because that's something that I do know a lot better in terms of pedagogy, in terms of curriculum, and in terms of overall structure. The public university system is seriously compromised to the extent that a lot of private institutions will be valorized as providing education, let alone quality education. We will see increasingly large numbers of private institutions which will be offering whatever degrees private institutions wish to offer. In the public education system, there are 2 moves, maybe 3 moves, that seriously impact education. The first is an overemphasis on quote-unquote multidisciplinary education. Multidisciplinarity, or a certain amount of latitude in learning, instead of being straitjacketed in standard subjects. And if we just concentrate on STEM, it will be physics, chemistry, or chemistry, or mathematics, or biology, or. So instead of the or, you replace it by and. But that is one. But emphasizing it as a necessary quality is something which, to my mind, goes a little too far, because it does so without a knowledge or without adequate care to curriculum. Right? You cannot have anybody making innovations in science and technology if they don't have the basics. Right? And it's not that nobody is forcing people not to have good basics. It is just that the structure that is put in place is something where it gets very difficult to do all this within our system. Right? Okay, so that's one point. The second is the insistence on, and I'm seeing it now at this institution, that we must have multiple entries and multiple exit options. This is tied into something called an ABC, which is the Academic Bank of Credits, right? So education is now reduced to some kind of a commodity where you pick up some course over here, some course over there, you put it all together and you get a degree. Now, you see, I mean, if it came out as an idea of pedagogues or of people who are actually running institutions, it would be one thing. This is coming out of some completely managerial process which somehow doesn't seem to gel with the system. But let me sort of, for those who are not conversant with the NEP 2020, there is this belief that students should be able to leave an institution after 1 year, after 2 years, after 3 years, or after 4 years, and get degrees of various, or get pieces of paper of various kinds. So after 1 year, you have to leave with a certificate. After 2 years, you leave with a diploma, and so on and so forth. All right? Students who come into the IIT system are coming to become, let us say, mechanical engineers. They usually take their first mechanical engineering course after 1.5 semesters. Maybe, maybe in the second year they will take their first course in mechanical engineering. Should they opt to leave after 1 year, what certificate do they get? What value is it? Now, the point is that, you see, if this is a practical problem, we can say we won't give it or something. The government of India has now linked your funding to your adoption of the ABC. You don't adopt the ABC, you will not get institutional funding. So people are running, naturally, because many of these public institutions do rely on government funding. So you implement it in some way or the other, which means that you are forced into this kind of system where every institution is undermined basically by interfering with its autonomy. So one of the great things about our educational system was, in fact, the autonomy that even at the levels that we had it, I taught at JNU for 35 years, and I know the level of autonomy that we practice without necessarily having things written down in paper and so on. But today such things are impossible because you have to conform to a particular straitjacket. It's not the institutions I'm worried about, it is really the students who are going to come out of this process. There is this illusion that you can get into one degree and move out with something else, that you can combine physics and photography, or chemistry and I don't know, sociology, or all these funny combinations. The NEP actually talks about the requirement of doing this. So to me, the structure of the NEP, which says that you must be moving towards a liberal notion of the arts, that this must be brought into Indian education, the kind of education that will be required for the 21st century, is at variance with any move that we may have for self-reliance. Because the people who are going to come out of this process, there will be exceptions. Okay, there will always be exceptions. So let me not say that the situation is bleak. But when you tamper with the foundations of education in such a drastic manner, one fears that the average student, and the average student in our country has been emphasized time and again, is a first-generation learner. Just in sheer terms of numbers, the student that we should be thinking about in time to come is a first-generation learner with likely illiterate parents, definitely illiterate grandparents. So the kind of student that we are trying to create over here is really at variance with two things. On the one hand, it is at variance with the kind of self-reliance that you want, because the technical expertise is not going to be there. And it is also at variance with the expectations that the student has. When coming into the educational system, they would like to be enabled. Many of the degrees that are posited in the NEP do not actually lead to employment. A liberal arts education is not going to fetch anybody employment, especially for the bulk of our population. We need to realize that for a large number of people, having a ITI type of technical education skill enablement is much more important. Okay. I'll wind up, just give me a few minutes, because there is one other serious way in which the NEP is impacting even their own goal of Atmanirbharta. A fundamental component of Atmanirbharta, self-reliance, what have you, is not just the ability to assemble in India, okay, or disassemble in India. All right? What we need to do is to actually innovate in India. There is a need for innovation, and the need for innovation can only be fueled by two things. One is to enable we need to enable the people who will innovate. See, arguably, those who are, already in the IIT system and are looking towards going to Silicon Valley, they will innovate for the US. We need people to innovate for India because so many of our problems are so local. And here is where I think there's a big problem in how research funding, especially at the university system, is being impacted by the NEP. The NEP is changing the landscape of research funding by creating a mega structure called the National Research Foundation. And that National Research Foundation, if our finance minister may be trusted, has already allocated 50,000 crores of rupees for distribution in the future. Oh, it's not even on paper, it's in air. One of the Pancha Mahabhutas. Right? So, no, see, an announcement of 50,000 crores is not a delivery of 50,000 crores. Okay, so that's the gap between the intention and the delivery is there also. But even if they were to deliver 50,000 crores, 50,000 crores goes for big science. And any big project, as Prabir showed us, lovely pictures, you want to build a LHC, you want to build a Hadron Collider over here, you will have to import everything, including the screws. You will not be able to make anything in India. You will also have difficulty assembling it in India. So the NRF way of funding mega science, or even the intention of funding mega science in this way, and removing the possibility of funding smaller science, smaller projects. I know the systems have been corrupt. Okay, I'm not an apologist for the way things were. I have no nostalgia for the improper ways in which things were done. However, by putting all the eggs into the NRF basket, this again, it emphasizes the importance of big science versus what we actually need, given our diversity and what have you. See, a big science project cannot go to Assam. Big science projects cannot, they will be constrained by airport availabilities, by geography, by local industries and so on. So, to me, the NRF way of funding science as envisaged in the NEP is I'm not saying whether it's right or wrong, it is at variance with Atmanirbharta. So it is something that really will have a serious impact on it. In the effort to clean up so many of the ills of the past, another thing which has been done is to, there are and there will be many opinions on this. But recently, the government of India, in addition to announcing a conference on the Panchamahabhutas and so on and so forth, Akash Tattva, and there will be more. All the other 5 are all waiting to come. But also all the award and the reward structure in the Indian establishment has been done away with. Now this, one can have different opinions about it, but to me, one of the ways in which you do get self-reliance is to encourage at some stage, you've got to reward at some stage, and also not encourage and not reward where appropriate. Right? So if there have been mistakes of over recognition and so on. I mean, I say this because at least one of the reasons why Prabir asked me is that I was at some point in time associated with the, I'm still associated with the Indian Academy of Sciences. But I think that this kind of, a society has to recognize what it values. Say it in whichever way. But if we do not acknowledge what we value, we will never encourage and make a place where things can grow. And if you cannot make a place where things can grow, again, the impact on Atmanirbharta is there. So let me stop over here now. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. The nice thing about having friends talk before you is not simply that they make all the points you wanted to make, but they actually make them better than you could have made them. And this fills you with a very warm and fuzzy sensation of vicarious achievement. So I promised Prabir that he is welcome to as much of my time as he needs. So I'm in negative time at the moment, which Ashok is being generous with me about. There is a little note circulated. I'm aware that that note comes as though it was the postscript of Prabir's voluminous note and therefore may not be noticeable. But it is there. What I'm going to do is simply allude to items in that note, which I think we may miss discussing at length over the 2 days of a far more traditional progressive meaning of the term self-reliance that we will inevitably be discussing, that Ashok has laid out, that Prabir has made mention of, and that Ram has in somewhat more orthogonal ways, somewhat more other direction ways, begun to identify as well. What I'm going to point out is that there are multiple layers to the meanings of the 2 words that we are using, to self and to reliance. Who exactly is the self that we are talking about? Is this an indivisible national self, which is the way we tend to talk about this quite frequently when we talk about national level self-reliance? There's no question that that's an extremely important component. But I think it's worthwhile for us to keep in mind the question of, is that the only identifier, is that the only categorization of self at the national level that's important when we talk about ideas of self-reliance as they are connected to social justice and equity? And I suggest to you that they're not. that there are multiple layers of our identities. We have a national identity and that we share, of course, but we also have linguistic identities, we have regional identities, we have social identities in a variety of ways, some happily non-hierarchical, some unhappily extraordinarily hierarchical. And in all of those, there are issues of where that identity positions us when we begin to think about reliance. Reliance on what? Reliance for what? Reliance in what? All of these become questions of, I think, pressing importance, especially when we are connecting the progressive ideals of national self-reliance with the issues that relate to social justice and equity. And I'm urging, not that I have answers to provide, I'm simply urging that all of us think about these issues as we begin to discuss the nuances of self-reliance as we go forward. This is going to be one issue. I'm going to do a second component which relates to the fact that we are pretending that we have come out of a 3-year pandemic. I'm saying we are pretending we are coming out of a 3-year pandemic because we have not as yet come out of the pandemic, even though all of us, me included, have decided that we are going to pretend. The pandemic is not over. However, our experiences during the pandemic as a nation, as communities, as individuals, responding to the real problems created by the pandemic and by responses to the pandemic, all of these, I suggest, provide object lessons from a variety of directions for us to consider when we think about ideas of self-reliance. So let me give you 2 examples. Drawn completely randomly while I'm sitting there. So these are not systematically thought through either in Prabir's fashion nor in the fashion that Ram has, in the sense that he spent many years thinking about these issues. This is casual, and if I can come up with these examples casually, I suggest that there's a great deal to learn from re-examining ourselves in a collective mirror in terms of how we responded to the pandemic and what lessons for self-reliance there would be. So 2 examples. Number 1, everybody has heard of Covaxin, right? I'm not going to get into whether Covaxin works very well or not and so on and so forth. The fact of the matter is that the design of Covaxin, to use their word, the innovation of Covaxin, is ancient. It was the first straightforward way of making a vaccine against a microbe by taking the microbe, either making it weak or killing it altogether, and then injecting it so that the immune system learns to recognize the microbe as a target in a safe fashion, because the microbe is no longer dangerous. This is it. So as soon as you grow the microbe, which the National Institute of Virology, the Indian Council of Medical Research National Institute of Virology, it is insisted that they be named like that, cultivated the virus of COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2, and as soon as they cultivated it, the vaccine became possible, because once you cultivate it, you can either kill it or inactivate it, and you can inject it and you can make a vaccine, right? So you have a vaccine technology. Is this a homegrown vaccine technology? Yes, it is. Is it a particularly innovative technology? No, but it doesn't matter. If it works, what do we care? The question here is, and I ask a poll, how many people got Covaxin? See, it's extraordinary. Every location that I have asked this question in actually comes up with 10% as the answer. And that's precisely what at the national level the supply ratio has been between Covishield and Covaxin. So what's worth asking is, we had a self-reliant vaccine technology. On the other hand, and this was created by the public sector, Right? It was created by the Indian Council of Medical Research for the public good. This is an absolute stellar example of self-reliance. हम एस्ट्राजेनेका के पास काहे गए? 90% of our vaccine comes from AstraZeneca via the good offices of Adar Poonawalla. Does it work? Yes. Now, some of us have quibbles about how well Covaxin works and so on and so forth. Sabko chhod do. What is the real problem? Covaxin was made, Covaxin began to be manufactured. Would we not have bought more and more doses of Covaxin if they had been manufactured? Yes, of course we would have bought them. So what was the problem? The problem was not even that Covishield was available and in the marketplace. The problem was that Covaxin could not be manufactured on large scale. So why is Covaxin not possible to manufacture in a large scale in the economic industrial establishment that we have been using for its production is worth asking as a self-reliance question. And that is, you're growing an infectious virus. It's an infectious virus that causes a disease. It's the disease that's causing the pandemic. You need to be extraordinarily careful when you grow it in large amounts. कहीं leak हो जाए, कहीं छूट जाए, कहीं इधर उधर फैल जाए. So you need industrial establishments that take great care for containment. Under those circumstances, you cannot manufacture in large amounts in one mega location for safety and security reasons. What would have been the answer? The answer would have been, this is a publicly generated vaccine. License it far and wide to small companies which will manufacture it in multiple locations, which will make modest safety containments. नहीं किए हम. क्यों नहीं किए? इसलिए नहीं किए कि we have killed off, as Ashok and Praveer pointed out, we have killed off our public sector enterprises to the point where we are no longer capable of manufacturing even publicly generated goods like Covaxin in public sector utilities. So what do? We transfer it to a private sector utility. What does the private sector utility do? It's not my case that they are behaving evilly. They are looking after their own profits. Of course they are. And therefore, they are trying to make it on their own. There is only so much they can make, but they are not willing to let other private sector players manufacture it until the pressure of public opinion 1 year later begins to insist that further licensing be done to other agencies. There are lessons for how to configure self-reliance down the entire pipeline of innovation to production in this one single example. My second example and my last example is to do with the fact that everybody has heard, in addition to Covaxin, of the other great self-reliant Indian innovation during the time of the pandemic. And that innovation is called Coronil. How many people have heard of Coronil? So, what is the context in which we should be looking at the out and out fraudulent claims of innovation like Coronil? I'm not making this as a case for bashing self-interested frauds for their efforts to make money on the back of people's misery. What I'm trying to get at is a very, very large proportion of our citizens were persuaded, and were persuaded with the rhetoric of self-reliance, with the rhetoric that sounds progressive, that sounds liberal, and yet this is where it brought them into taking pretend material and hoping that it was going to protect them from something. And this brings me to that last point that I've made in the note, which is that for marginalized, disempowered, peripheral communities of the country, which we are still an overwhelming majority of, being well informed with reliable information and being well equipped with the ability to think about this information critically is a fundamental requirement for ideas of self-reliance in this country. And therefore, if we do not integrate the system-level discussions that you have heard with grassroots level empowerment of what both the Delhi Science Forum and the All India People Science Network talk about, which is fundamentally empowering the individual citizen for her ability to acquire information and for her ability to critically think through that information, we will not be adequately rising to the challenge of imagining self-reliance. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay, is there any time for discussion or there's no time? So we'll have to conclude here, otherwise I think we're almost eaten up in the next session's time. Okay. Oh, coffee and tea time, okay. Oh, anyway, if you maintain the discipline, the time for coffee and tea is only 10 minutes.
Make it 15. Start 5 minutes.
If you say 10 minutes,
Absolutely.